Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We're diving into a powerful phrase that drives so much global action: all nations.
Powerful indeed.
You know, you, our listener, probably have heard this phrase in connection with something we call the Great Commission.
Oh, yeah.
And today we're going straight to the source, to Scripture, to really unpack what this crucial instruction means for us.
Yeah, this command is really, it's so central. But the way that we understand all nations has huge implications. Like, what are we really aiming to do? Are we trying to reach as many people as possible?
Like just numbers.
Just numbers, right,
Wow.
wherever they happen to be. Or is there something deeper embedded in that phrase, all nations? So that's what this deep dive is really all about. We've been digging through biblical texts and theological insights to try to bring you, the listener, a clearer picture.
So let's get right to it. Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. This is really ground zero for this discussion. This is where Jesus gives this command, this Great Commission. And it's not just for the original disciples, is it?
No, it's not. And that's clear, especially when you get to that last promise to the very end of the age. That really kind of widens the scope.
It does.
Right,
Yeah.
that promise, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age, that makes it clear. This isn't just a one-time assignment for a small group of guys. It's an ongoing mission for the entire church.
Throughout history.
Throughout history. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the key words here that we are really drilling down on are make disciples of all nations, or in the Greek, pantata ethne.
Okay. Now, when we, typical modern English speakers, when we hear nations, what pops into our minds usually are countries on a map, political borders.
Right.
But the Greek word ethnos, this is where it gets really interesting because it's so closely tied to our word ethnic, to people groups.
Yes.
To this idea of a shared identity.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. While our English word nation often has that political feel, right? You think about the United Nations, it's all these different countries. But ethnos in the New Testament, it very frequently refers to a specific people group. People who share a common culture, a common language, and very often a common ethnic background as well. So that really is the core question we're exploring today. When Jesus said, pantata ethne, was his main focus making disciples of all of these different distinct ethnic groups around the world?
Okay, so let's really kind of dig down into this word ethnos a bit more. You've done a lot of examination looking at how this word appears throughout the New Testament, both the singular and plural form. What have you discovered? What stood out to you?
Well, what's really striking is how consistently the singular form, ethnos, is used. It never, ever refers to a single individual.
Not even once.
Not even once. Every time it pops up in the singular, it's talking about a whole people group or nation. Yeah, it's really remarkable. Like, you think about Matthew 24.7, where it says, nation will rise against nation. Clearly, that's not talking about, just individuals squabbling with each other. It's talking about these larger social groups, these conflicts between nations.
Yeah.
Or think about Acts 2.5. It describes all of these devout Jews who are gathered in Jerusalem, and it says they're from every nation under heaven. Again, it's groups of people defined by where they come from.
Their origin.
Right.
Yeah.
Even 1 Peter 2.9, it talks about believers being called a holy nation. And that emphasizes a kind of a collective identity, a shared identity. And then Revelation 5.9, it speaks about people being ransomed for God from every nation. And that's listed alongside tribe and language, making it very clear that nation in this context is this kind of corporate concept.
So that is a strong pattern. Like, you would expect at least one instance of the word ethnos referring to an individual if that were a common usage.
You would think, yeah.
So what about the plural form, ethne? Is that consistent too?
Well, the plural ethne has a bit more flexibility. It can certainly refer to multiple people groups, just like the singular. So, for instance, we see this in Acts 13.19, where it talks about God destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Clearly, multiple groups there. Or in Romans 4.1, where Abraham is called the father of many nations, obviously meaning numerous people groups. And then Revelation 11.9, it mentions people from peoples and tribes and languages and nations looking at dead bodies. So again, all of these are distinct collective entities.
Right. So the plural can be groups, but you mentioned it can also have a different meaning as well.
That's right. The plural ethne can also just refer to Gentile individuals, without necessarily implying a specific ethnic group.
Okay.
So, for instance, in Acts 13.48, when Paul turns his focus to the Gentiles in Antioch, it says that they began to rejoice, right? So this is a group of individual non-Jews in that particular city. Or similarly, in 1 Corinthians 12.2, Paul reminds the Corinthians, he says, when you were pagans,
Yeah.
So he's referring to their past lives as individuals. And Ephesians 3.6, that speaks about individual Gentiles becoming fellow heirs with Jewish believers in Christ.
Okay, so singular ethnos, always people group. Plural ethne can be people groups or individual Gentiles. How does all this help us understand pantata ethne in the Great Commission?
Okay, so here's where it all connects. Because that singular form ethnos always has that corporate meaning, it really strongly suggests that when we see that plural used in these broad, kind of all-encompassing statements like all nations, yeah,
Yeah.
all that there's a high likelihood that it's carrying that underlying sense of distinct people groups.
Huh.
So unless the specific context is really, really pushing us in a different direction, that foundational meaning of ethnos as a people
Yeah.
group, that seems to hold a lot of weight.
That makes a lot of sense. So you've looked at all the places where this phrase panta ethne or similar phrases show up in the New Testament. What did you find?
So pantata ethne, or some variation of it, it shows up 18 times across the entire New Testament. And what's fascinating is that only one time does the context really absolutely require it to mean individual Gentiles, and that's Matthew 25.32.
Only 1 out of 18. That's a pretty compelling statistic. What about the other instances?
Well, on the flip side, you have 9 instances where the context absolutely demands that we take it as referring to people groups.
Wow.
Yeah, so think about Acts 2.5. You have all of these devout Jews from every nation gathering in Jerusalem for Pentecost. That's very clearly about people from all these different ethnic and national origins. Or Acts 10.35. It says that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Again, groups of people in different places. And then Acts 17.26, it says that from one man, God made every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. This isn't about individual Gentiles being created. It's about the formation of distinct people groups across the globe.
Yeah, and some of these connections are even stronger because they actually tie back directly into the Old Testament, right?
Exactly. So you have 6 other instances of pantata ethne that are either directly quoting from the Old Testament or they're clear allusions to the Old Testament. And in these cases, the meaning is undeniably about nations or people groups.
Oh, okay.
So, take, for example, Mark 11.17, where Jesus is quoting from Isaiah, and he says that the temple should be a house of prayer for all the nations. In the original Hebrew there, it uses the phrase all peoples. Or Luke 21.24, that passage echoes the prophecies in Ezekiel talking about Jerusalem being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And in this passage, it talks about people being led captive among all the nations. And again, the Hebrew equivalent uses the word goyim, which means nations. Or Galatians 3.8.
Yeah.
There's another instance where it quotes from Genesis talking about how in Abraham all the nations shall be blessed.
That's a key one, yeah.
Right. And the Hebrew there is all families. And then in Revelation 15.4, we read about all the nations coming and worshiping before God. And that draws directly from Psalm 86. So all of these Old Testament roots, they really provide a strong argument for taking pantata ethne in the New Testament as referring primarily to people groups.
So 1 instance must be individuals, 9 must be people groups. What about the remaining 8?
Well, the remaining 8 are a little bit more ambiguous. The context doesn't definitively force us to go one way or the other.
Okay.
But I think when you look at the big picture, the fact that singular ethnos consistently means people group, the fact that the plural often refers to people groups, and especially the fact that a majority of the pantata ethne instances, especially those tied to the Old Testament, emphasize people groups, that really tilts the scales.
Yeah, the weight of the evidence.
The weight of the evidence, yeah, that's a good way to put it. The weight of the evidence strongly suggests that all the nations in the Great Commission probably means all the people groups.
That is really significant, that point, because it definitely shifts how you might initially understand that Great Commission. And, you mentioned that this New Testament vision isn't something totally new, right? It actually has really deep roots in the Old Testament itself.
Yeah, that's right. If you read through the Old Testament, it's just saturated with this anticipation, this hope that one day God would be worshipped by people from literally every corner of the earth.
Yeah.
And this is the bedrock. This is the very foundation upon which the New Testament missionary vision is built. You think about the promise that God made to Abraham back in Genesis 12:1-3, and it says, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
That's a famous one, yeah?
Yeah, it's a huge one. And this idea of a universal blessing extending to all of these families, and actually that word families in the Hebrew is mishpihat, and very often refers to smaller groupings like clans. It's echoed throughout the book of Genesis.
Okay.
And really importantly, in three other places where this promise is repeated, the phrase that's used is all the nations.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the Hebrew there is kol goy, and the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it consistently renders this as pantata ethne.
Every single time.
Every single time. So even way back in Genesis, you see this connection between these smaller family units, if you will, or clans, and the broader term nations, pointing towards these distinct people groups.
So even in the Old Testament, the language kind of hints at these distinct people groups as being a central focus.
Yes.
And the New Testament writers, they clearly understood this connection.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So, for instance, Peter in Acts 3:25, he refers back to the Abrahamic promise, and he says, in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And he uses that Greek word patriae for families, which is another term that often denotes people groups like clans. And then Paul in Galatians 3:8, he quotes that same promise, but he put pantata ethne, all the nations, making a really clear link between the Old Testament promise and this New Testament understanding of reaching all these distinct ethnic groups.
And it wasn't just this one promise, was it? Like the whole Old Testament just seems to be overflowing with this expectation.
Yeah, it really is. Throughout the Old Testament, you find all these exhortations to declare God's glory among the nations. You find promises that nations will come to God's light. You have prayers for God to be praised among the nations. You even have these plans to make God's greatness known to the nations.
Yeah.
And the Psalms and Isaiah are just packed full of these kinds of hopes.
Yeah.
And the underlying idea is this. Israel's blessing, it was never intended to be just for Israel. It was meant to be this channel through which blessing would flow out to all the peoples of the earth.
It's interesting you even brought up the story of Jonah, right?
Yeah.
Not exactly the most enthusiastic missionary at first.
No, not at all.
But even his story, it illustrates God's concern for people beyond Israel's borders.
Absolutely. Jonah's initial reluctance to go to Nineveh, this major pagan city, it really underscores God's heart, his intention to extend his mercy and salvation to people from every nation, not just the people of Israel.
Yeah.
And Jesus himself said, someone greater than Jonah is here, implying that his mission to bring salvation that had this even wider scope extending to all the peoples of the earth.
So with this Old Testament foundation, let's look at how the apostles, particularly Paul and John, understood their missionary work. Did their actions and what they wrote, did it reflect this focus on people groups?
They absolutely did. Paul's understanding of the Abrahamic promise, that it was being fulfilled through Christ, that believers from every nation were becoming spiritual descendants of Abraham through faith, that really supports this. He saw his mission as taking that promised blessing to these various people groups. And his use of Isaiah 49:6, I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. To explain his calling to minister to the Gentiles in Acts 13:47, it really illustrates this. He wasn't just going to individual non-Jews. His focus was on reaching the nations as a whole.
Yeah, and his drive to preach the gospel in places where Christ wasn't already known, that seems like a pretty key indicator.
Yeah, it's a really crucial point. In Romans 15:18-24, Paul describes how he's fulfilled the ministry of the gospel from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum. And then he says, and thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand. He's quoting from Isaiah 52:15 there. And, this wasn't simply about geographic expansion. He was interested in reaching unreached peoples, those who had never had the message of Christ proclaimed to them within their specific cultural and linguistic group. He saw his role as a pioneer, as someone going out and establishing this witness among these distinct people group where one didn't yet exist.
So his primary goal, it wasn't just racking up individual converts in areas where the gospel had already taken root.
No, that's a really important distinction. While he certainly did share the gospel with individuals he encountered, his overarching strategic aim was to penetrate new people groups with the message of Christ, to really plant those seeds of the church within those distinct communities. And that's why he could say that he had fulfilled the ministry in a particular region, even if not every single person there had become a believer. He had reached key people groups within that area, establishing this foundation for the gospel to spread further from there.
And John's vision in the book of Revelation, it's pretty powerful.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of paints this picture of the ultimate outcome of this global mission.
Yeah, it does. Revelation 5.9 to 10, it describes this vast multitude from every tribe and language and people and nation gathered around the throne, worshiping the Lamb. And this vision, it really strongly emphasizes that the ultimate goal is to gather those who have been ransomed by Christ from all of these distinct people groups. And it echoes what we see in John 11.50 to 52, where Caiaphas' prophecy about Jesus dying for the nation is interpreted as Jesus dying not only for the Jewish nation, but also to gather into one body the children of God who are scattered abroad, that is, scattered among all the nations.
Yeah, that phrase scattered abroad, it really suggests these believers disperse throughout all these different people groups.
Exactly. And John 10:16, where Jesus says, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. That further points to his intention to gather believers from beyond just the Jewish people, from all of these diverse groups around the world. And then the way that Revelation consistently depicts the redeemed as coming from all nations, tribes, peoples, and languages, that really reinforces this central focus on reaching these distinct collective entities.
So if Paul and John, they both seem to be operating with this understanding of reaching people groups, what about Jesus himself? Did his instructions and his actions, did they align with this perspective as well?
Yeah, all the evidence really seems to indicate that they did. In Luke 24.4547, Jesus connects the preaching of repentance and forgiveness of sins to all nations with what is written, he says, in the Old Testament. And as we've seen, the Old Testament hope is very much centered on the nations. And then his commission in Acts 1.8 to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth, that also aligns with the Old Testament association of the ends of the earth with these distant and diverse peoples. And then in Mark 11.17, Jesus quotes Isaiah 56.7, saying that these temples should be a house of prayer for all the nations, or all the peoples, directly demonstrating his awareness of this Old Testament hope for all peoples to worship the one true God.
So the Great Commission itself, Matthew 28.15, when we consider all of this context, all of this background, it probably wasn't just about, getting as many individual converts as possible, wherever they happen to be.
Yeah, the weight of the scriptural evidence really does seem to point toward Jesus intending the Great Commission to focus on making disciples of all the people groups of the world. And this aligns perfectly with his promise in Matthew 24.14, that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So the scope of the proclamation matches the scope of the discipling, reaching all the distinct peoples.
Okay, this naturally leads to another question. What exactly is a people group? Is there like a hard and fast definition in the Bible that we can point to?
It seems unlikely that the Bible intends to give us this rigid, precise, kind of scientific definition. But we do see descriptive terms being used. Revelation 5.9 gives us tribe, language, people, and nation. Genesis 12.3 used the term families. And language, is certainly a very significant marker. And while there are different ways to estimate the number of people groups in the world, the figures range from, 10,000 to 20,000, depending on the criteria that are used, the core idea seems to be a significantly large group of individuals who share a strong sense of common identity. And that identity, it's often based on their language, their ethnicity, or their shared cultural heritage.
You mentioned earlier that people and nation, these terms can sometimes be used almost interchangeably.
Yeah.
What about that term families that's used in the Old Testament?
So that term families, mishpehat in Hebrew, it's often translated as clans, and it seems to refer to these groupings that are smaller than tribes but larger than individual households. We see examples of this in Exodus chapter 6 and Joshua chapter 7, for example. So it appears that, the scope of all nations likely encompasses even these smaller clan-like societies. And the term ethnos itself seems to be, a general enough term to apply to these groups of various sizes that are united by a shared identity.
Okay, so we're aiming to reach all these different distinct people groups.
Yes.
But what does it practically mean for a group to be reached versus unreached?
Well, the most widely accepted definition of an unreached people group, it emerged in about 1982. And it defines an unreached people group as one where there's no indigenous community of believing Christians with the numbers and resources adequate to evangelize their own people group.
Okay.
So reached in this context means there's an established self-sustaining evangelizing church within that particular people group. And while reaching in a narrow sense can simply mean that the gospel has been proclaimed in some way to a group, a tract was dropped or something, the broader biblical understanding that's tied to this idea of making disciples, that implies a response, a genuine response, and the formation of a community of believers who can then carry the message forward within their own culture, in their own language.
Yeah, so it's not just about initial contact. It's about this lasting, self-replicating presence of the gospel within that group.
Yeah, exactly. And Paul's example of completing his missionary work by planting churches, but then leaving others to continue the work of evangelism and discipleship, that really highlights this.
Yeah.
His focus was on getting that initial foothold, that initial community of believers established, and then moving on. Right.
Planting that seed.
Exactly. Now, I should say, defining reached can get a little bit ambiguous, especially when you're dealing with very small or closely related groups. That's where frameworks like the E-scales come into play.
What are those?
The E-scales, so E1, E2, and E3, they recognize different levels of cultural and linguistic distance between, the missionary and the target group. But the fundamental calling to frontier missionary work among these truly unreached people groups, that remains very clear.
Okay, so what are the practical implications then of understanding the Great Commission in this way? Who should be focusing on this kind of specific mission to unreached peoples?
Yeah, the implications are huge. This suggests that every denomination and even every local church should have a deliberate and strategic focus on this kind of Paul to mission.
Yeah.
They should be actively identifying, recruiting, equipping, sending, and supporting those who are called to go to these unreached people groups. And their primary task, it's not just about individual conversions in places where the gospel is already present and vibrant. It's about prioritizing the establishment of a church, a self-replicating witness among every distinct people group on the planet.
So ultimately, why this emphasis on reaching all peoples? What's the big picture here? What's the purpose?
Well, it goes straight to the heart of the supremacy of God. God's ultimate goal is to see himself worshipped by people from all the nations. His overarching purpose is to display his glory for the enjoyment of his people. And that includes people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And that incredible diversity that we see in the world's nations, it's not a hindrance to God's plan. It's actually a key part of it. It magnifies his glory in these really profound ways.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about that. How does the diversity of nations actually enhance God's glory?
Well, first, there's a greater beauty and power in the praise that comes from unity and diversity. It's like a magnificent choir with voices from every background, all singing in perfect harmony. Second, God's fame and worth are increased as he is recognized and worshipped by a wider array of peoples. It demonstrates his universal appeal and his ultimate lordship.
Like he's not just a local deity,
He's the God of all.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Third, the strength and wisdom and love of Christ. Those are even more clearly seen as he inspires faith and devotion in followers from literally every conceivable culture. And finally, this focus on reaching all peoples, it really undercuts any sense of ethnocentric pride. It reminds us that all of humanity, regardless of background, is equally dependent on God's free and gracious love. Ultimately, God's aim is to prepare for himself a humble people drawn from every people group on earth to worship him for eternity.
Wow. This has been a truly insightful deep dive into the meaning of all nations. So just to bring it all together, the scriptural evidence really seems to strongly indicate that the Great Commission's call to all nations, or pantata ethne, emphasizes reaching these distinct people groups all around the world, rather than just focusing solely on maximizing individual conversions, wherever they may be.
Yeah, that's the real key takeaway here. From the Old Testament prophecies to the New Testament commands and visions of the future, the consistent thread that runs through it all is this focus on pantata ethne as encompassing all of the diverse people groups of the world.
This definitely gives us a lot to think about regarding the scope and the nature of global missions and, even our individual roles within it. What new questions or areas of exploration does this understanding, does it open up for you, our listener?
Yeah, I hope so.
It really underscores this enduring and profound nature of this mission that's so deeply rooted in God's eternal purposes. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See ya.